At the Munich Security Conference, Vice President J.D. Vance made some comments that were certainly long overdue. Let me post them here.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values, we must live them.
Europe's long-standing opposition to free speech is something too many American leaders have been quiet about, and I commend J.D. Vance for taking the time to actually highlight these things. I think our leadership has been a little afraid to confront Europe about its hypocrisy. First, how they treat free speech, how they treat our shared values as a community, how they want our defense and yet refuse to pay for it, with us shouldering a majority of the funding for NATO, and their approach to democracy has been absolutely horrendous. We can't, as a civilization, as a shared civilization, he highlighted how important it was for us to work together, and that means maintaining our values. What are we fighting for if we're turning our back on the values that have made us great? And that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is under assault, and the European Union has been more of a perpetuator of oppressing free speech than even Russia has been. And so his comments were incredibly important. But I've got a few more examples for you. Germany's Network Enforcement Act is a perfect example of why this is a problem. There was a comedian named Jan Bacherman who had his content removed and was punished by the government simply for criticizing the Turkish government. I mean, it wasn't even the German government, it was the Turkish government he was criticizing. How can we say we're a free society when people are punished for satire or even comedy? The UK created buffer zones, and this is something Vance mentioned, was that if within a certain area of an abortion clinic or whatnot, you decide to engage in any kind of a group prayer to that effect, then you could be punished, arrested, fined. I mean, how in a free society, first we're going to punish the free exercise of religion, and secondly, punish people for exercising that religion and praying for people. In one of the examples Vance mentioned, he talked about how there was a man who was praying a few blocks away for his own aborted child, not as an act of political protest against the clinic, but for the crime he felt he committed and how he felt ashamed about it. I mean, that's got to be a horrible thing to feel and to do, and this man simply praying and being arrested for it is a horrendous crime against free speech. France actually banned anti-government protest in 2023, and this is on top of holding the Telegram founder hostage because he refused to give them a backdoor entry into Telegram. So France has been going in the wrong direction when it comes to free speech for a very long time. We're really far from the ideas of the French Revolution when France is throwing people in jail for protesting their bad policies. And so these governments, these are just a few examples of what he was talking about. And you have to wonder, why are our tax dollars, why is our funding, why is our support going to a continent who's going the opposite of freedom? Now, I love Europe. I spend a couple months in Europe every year. So it's not like these are horrible, evil, monstrous people, but the truth is they don't share our values. I spent time with Europeans. I have a lot of friends over there. They don't believe in the things that we believe in. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in a right to self-defense at all. Gun issue aside, they don't believe in self-defense. You should wait for the government to come. I mean, these people do not share our values. And you have to wonder, if they don't share our values, what do we share? Because if they're not practicing what they preach, how can we go out into the rest of the world and condemn countries like China or North Korea for oppressing their citizens when the Europeans are doing the same thing and pretending that they're not? Either we live in a world that is free or we don't. And J.D. Vance highlighting that in his speech is incredibly important. We've got to start holding our European allies' feet to the fire, or they need to not be our allies anymore. It's really that simple. The next example J.D. Vance highlighted in this speech, and I highly recommend you watch the entire thing, was a discussion where he had about how the Romanians canceled their own elections.
Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
J.D. Vance also highlighted the resilience of democracy in the face of Russian interference, or so-called Russian interference. A few $100,000 in media shakes your democracy. It isn't that strong to begin with. And we've been using, and I mean the European Union and the Democratic Party in the US, has been using Russian interference as a scapegoat for them losing elections to the center-right and to the alt-right political parties within Europe. They blame AfD, for example, in Germany, is constantly accused of being a mouthpiece for Russia when they're simply advocating for an end to open borders. And we have to recognize that we have an immigration crisis in Europe because America broke the Middle East. Okay, that's where all these migrants come from. The US and NATO have destroyed the Middle East, and these people have nowhere to go. And they're not going to stay and fight for their own countries. Maybe they can, maybe they don't want to, but either way, they've just decided to run to Europe, which is why we have all these immigrants there. He discusses more of that in the full speech. But so we're seeing countries like Romania, Moldova, Georgia, and France and Germany are all going towards right-leaning political parties that advocate for free markets, because you can't do anything in Germany right now because of this green agenda. It's horrendous. 75% of German businesses are offshoring their operations because the laws are so stringent. So there's a lot of reasons why right-wing political parties are winning across Europe, and the default answer to why the left is losing is because of Russian interference. The most recent example is in Georgia, where the Georgia Dream Party got 53% of the vote. We can't pretend that there wasn't something going on with Russians financing the elections. We know they were paying for votes in Moldova. We know they were involved in Romania. But they lost almost everywhere. Like their interference wasn't really that effective because the resilience of the people and their beliefs in being a part of the European Union and wanting to have political parties that represented their interests prevailed over these really, really bad efforts. They really should hire Russia's really bad at this. Like if they were good at it, maybe. Anyway, as a consultant, I see how they're going about trying to influence things, and I'm just amazed because they're just so bad at it. But so they're not getting the results that they want, largely because they kind of suck at interfering in these elections. But they're just trying to run some digital media campaigns. So I guess it's understandable, but all these countries where they're involved in are they're not winning. They're not having any success. They're failing. And despite this, the European Union wants to use this as an excuse to cancel elections or have new elections or enact these crazy laws that are really just an attempt by the left to maintain complete and total control, because that's what they want. They want to live in a totalitarian society where all speech is in support of them, and anything that is against them is hate speech. And that's what all these laws are about. And it's time we called them out on it. They need to change these laws, especially if they're going to be our allies. We can't go around the world pretending that we represent freedom when we don't. And that's what's happening more and more. We're in bed with these European countries and they don't share our values. They don't share our values. Arguably, people are freer in Moscow than they are in Berlin. That's just the reality. Same thing's true for Paris. And this is something that we have to recognize. We got to get Europe going the other way. I don't know if we can. Our founding fathers didn't think that we could. They felt that they didn't want us to be in alliances like NATO, specifically because they didn't believe that the European peoples were really able to have the kind of freedom that we had, because they were too entrenched with monarchs and dukes and lords, and they've really just replaced that with democratic systems that look like democracy but aren't. They're not as democratic or free as we think. And in trying to understand Poland and Germany, because I was interested in consulting on elections over there, I was really amazed at how not democratic it is. You have these political organizations that are almost completely in charge of the country. You don't get to elect directly candidates for a lot of offices over there. And you end up with these wealthy, powerful aristocrats who are in control of the entire process. And so they've really replaced the direct rule by the aristocrats with an intermediary to give the illusion of democracy. So these aren't free countries the way we think of them as free. Canada's free. That's a perfect example of what it should look like. But I guess Canada and how they're socialists and we don't want them in our country is probably a topic for another video. So you really need to watch what JD Vance had to say, because this is going to be a very pressing issue between the United States and Europe. And we're kind of getting to the point now where we have to ask ourselves if I hope we can help them, and I hope things go the other way. And it looks like the European people are with us, because center-right and right political parties are starting to make gains over there. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be any better for us in those positions. So Vance's comments are just important and long overdue. And this is a conversation we should have been having 15 years ago, as the European Union became more authoritarian and was arresting more people for engaging in their basic human rights of free speech. So please watch the speech, and good luck in your election.